Well, good morning, everyone. And as Dean said, today is World Hunger Sunday. And so I'd like to kind of take apart that gospel lesson that Karen just read for us a little bit, a very well-known passage, and see where we go with that. So first of all, I want you to imagine that you are a race car driver in the Indianapolis 500, okay? Now, the question is, how do you deal with the inherent risks associated with that sport? How would you deal with the possibility of crashing or even dying there on that racetrack? Well, according to one driver, you don't. You don't deal with it. You don't deal with it at all. If a fatal accident occurs, you don't go look at where it happened. You don't even watch films on television about it. You just don't deal with it. You pretend that it never happened. Well, the Indianapolis International Speedway operation itself encourages this approach. As soon as a track closes the day of an accident, there's a crew that heads out right away to paint over the spot where the car hit the wall. And through the years, do you know that a driver has never been pronounced dead on the Indianapolis 500 track? Never. Never. In a trip to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Racing Museum, located within that 2.5-mile oval, there is no memorial to the 40 drivers who have lost their lives there. In fact, there's no mention of it anywhere. Interesting, isn't it? Denial. 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 Living in denial is a favorite occupation of a lot of people. And some people would simply prefer not to face reality. Jane Wagner once said, "I made some studies, and reality is the leading cause of stress among those who are in touch with it." And she goes on to say, "I could take reality in small doses, but as a lifestyle, I find it too confining." Reality is stressful. And if we could only turn a blind eye to it, life would be so much easier. Our story for today is about a man who learned to do just that, turn a blind eye. Many of you know the story well. There's a rich man who is dressed in purple and fine linen, lives in luxury. And at his gate lie a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table, and the dogs would come and lick his sores. Well, the remainder of the parable is about how the rich man ignores Lazarus and the consequences that result. But the final words of the parable, for me, are the most interesting, where it says, "They will not be convinced, even if someone should rise from the dead." I want you to think about those lines for just a minute. I'm going to return to those at the end. So focus on these words. They will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. Now, some people do live in denial. Even if someone rises from the dead, they will not change their minds. Now, it's amazing how easy it is for us to recognize denial in other people, right? We're really good at that. We can recognize denial in other people. We see the young woman in love with an abuser, and we say, well, can't she see where this relationship is going, or doesn't she want to see? Or we see the middle-aged man not taking care of his body, and we say, well, can't he see what he's doing to himself? Sometimes we get frustrated when it's someone we care about and love. We want to grab them and shake them into reality. Don't they know if they don't get help for this problem, they're going to wreck their life and wreck the lives of those around them? Denial. And there are many possibilities for denial and living in that denial in terms of our Christian faith, our faith walk. Some of them are suggested in this story, this parable that Jesus told. Let's begin here. We're living in denial if we believe that casual Christianity is a viable option. Casual Christianity. It's a comfortable place to be. Eternal life with very few demands, forgiveness without true repentance, respectability with few responsibilities. It's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer referred to as cheap grace. Yes, it's a comfortable lifestyle, perhaps. The only problem is it's an illusion. You may remember the time-honored story of the frustrated skeptic who blurted out, "If I believed what you Christians believed, I would crawl through a field of broken glass to tell others about it." And if we think about it, which we try not to do, it is an accurate statement of fact. For some people, their commitment as Christians is a poor imitation of the real thing. And there are lots of excuses. Oh, man, we could think of all kinds of excuses. You may be familiar with the story of some GIs who were on furlough, and a commanding officer was furious when 9 of these soldiers failed to show up for roll call in the morning. The first man didn't straggle in until 7 p.m. "I'm sorry, sir," the soldier explained, "but I had a date, and I lost track of time, and I missed the bus back. However, being determined to get here on time, I hired a cab. And halfway here, the cab broke down. I went to a farmhouse, and I persuaded the farmer to sell me a horse. And I was riding the horse, but the horse fell over dead. And I walked the last 10 miles, and I just got here." Though skeptical, the commanding officer let the young man off with a reprimand. However, after him, 7 other stragglers showed up. 7 others in a row came with the exact same story. Had a date, missed the bus, hired a cab, bought a horse, the horse died, etc. Well, by the time the 9th man reported in, the CO had, of course, grown really weary of the story. So with a great deal of impatience, he asked, "And what happened to you?" "Sir," the GI said, "I had this date, and I missed the bus, and so I hired a cab." "Wait a minute," the commanding officer said. Wait a minute. Now don't tell me. The cab broke down." "No, sir," replied the soldier. "The cab didn't break down. It was just that there were so many dead horses in the road we couldn't get through." As they say, one excuse is as good as the next, right? Excuses. Yeah, one is as good as the next for letting our commitment to Christ assume a very low priority in our lives. Casual Christianity. Well, is that where we are today? Denial. It's wonderful, isn't it? Unfortunately, it's an illusion. Well, here's another example. We're living in denial if we believe we can be Lone Ranger Christians, and that is that we can ignore our neighbors, be blind to the needs of others, and still say that we follow Jesus. The rich man in Jesus' story seemed to be an expert at this. Lazarus lay right outside his door, and chances are he never saw him. Oh, maybe at first, but soon he was able to shut the desperate man out of his visual field. The poor beggar was an inconvenient truth, to use Al Gore's phrase, that the rich man was able to ignore. It's amazing how easy it is to do that. We at Grace try really hard not to ignore the needs of the poor. And we know that we have neighbors all around us, far and wide, who have serious needs. As we get out there into our community and survey our community, we find people with heartbreaking needs, people with dying parents struggling with a son or daughter's addiction, middle-aged people with tons of guilt, people in wheelchairs that can't get in and out of their homes. Sometimes all they need is a word of encouragement or an invitation to worship, a chance to express their grief, or maybe a wheelchair ramp that Al Rasper builds for them. We need to continue to work hard to get to know our neighbors far and wide and to understand their needs. We could live blissfully in our own little world. I mean, we could pretend that Jesus didn't say anything about being a good neighbor, about being sensitive to people who have special needs, but he did. And because he did, we need to follow that lead. We need to always take stock of how we live into that, because that's what we do here at Grace. That's what we do. I read a story recently about a good neighbor. It's sort of a contrast to the parable of today's lesson. There was a young woman who once lived in the remote town of Victory, Vermont. No school, no church, no store. And the town was famous for being the last town to get electricity in Vermont. During the course of earning her master's degree, this young woman found it necessary to commute several times a week from Victory to the State University in Burlington. It was a good 100 miles away or so. Well, coming home late at night, she would see an old man sitting by the side of the road. He was always there, sub-zero temperatures, nasty weather. No matter how late she returned, he just sat there. And he made no acknowledgement of her as she went by. She often wondered, what brought this old man to that same spot every evening? What stubborn habit, private grief, or mental disorder? Well, finally, she asked a neighbor, have you seen an old man who sits by the road late at night? Oh, yeah, said her neighbor, many times. Is he a little touched in the head? She asked. He's no more touched than you or me, her neighbor laughed. And he goes home right after you do. You see, he doesn't like the idea of you driving by yourself out all alone late at night on these back roads. So every night, he walks out to wait for you. And when he sees your taillights disappear around the bend, then he goes home to bed because he knows you're safe. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a neighbor like that? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be a neighbor like that? Our goal at Grace is not to live in denial, even though that's so much easier, but to be a neighbor like that old guy, to really care. Now, as a member of Grace, you should know by now that we believe we have a responsibility for the least and the lowest in our world. And one of the saddest occurrences of our time is how hard-hearted many Christians have become to the people at the bottom of society. Now, I know, sometimes it's not easy to love the poor. Some of them have the problems they have because they've been irresponsible. And some of them are not willing to help themselves even. And many have gotten to the point where they're powerless to help themselves. It's easy to ignore them. It's easy to shut them out. And we need to be continuously strengthening our commitment to the poor of the world and whisper there, but for the grace of God go I, and always be willing to help out. But like the rich man who ignored Lazarus, it's easy to build up a system of rationalization that make the poor and the hungry of the world seem invisible. Some are kind of like Bobby and Billy, two brothers who were assigned the responsibility of mowing the lawn and trimming the hedges while their parents went on a short trip. When the parents returned, nothing had been done. So Dad was very upset, and he asked Bobby, "What have you been doing while we were gone?" And Bobby replied in a low voice, "Nothing." And he turned to Billy and said, "Billy, what have you been doing?" He said, "I've been helping Bobby." Right? We sometimes help each other do nothing, don't we? Sometimes. Being casual in our commitment to Christ is not what he had in mind. That's not what he had in mind. Living in our own little world and ignoring our neighbors is not acceptable for a member of Grace. It's not acceptable. Jesus meant it when he said, "When you've done it for the least of these, you've done it for me." And we here in this church have always taken that very, very seriously. Stuart Jackson once wrote a novel that he titled The Davidson Affair. And here's how the story goes. There's a television news anchor by the name of Cass Tennell is sent by his network to cover an intriguing story. It seems that a man named Jesus Davidson has reportedly been resurrected from the dead in one of the outlying colonies of the Roman Empire. And so Cass Tennell interviews Pilate and Herod, and he hears them say there was no truth to the rumor. There's no truth to it. They tell him the grave was robbed. And then he interviews Thomas before Thomas has seen the Lord and finds him kind of dejected and unimpressed by the reports. But then come these electrifying interviews with Mary Magdalene and Zacchaeus and then Cleopas himself. Try as he might, the hard-headed reporter cannot keep himself but being persuaded by the testimony of these kind of artless people, obviously as thunderstruck by the developments as Cass Tennell himself. And so he begins to piece together his program, a kind of a 60 minutes, 20/20 style thing with commentary and interviews interspersed. And he puts it together intending to persuade and thinking that when people hear his witness, they'll begin to believe it too. But he's sadly mistaken. The TV higher-ups are as cynical as ever, delighted with his ratings, but uninterested in the subject. The book ends with a conversation between Cass Tennell, the reporter, and an associate. It goes like this. Even if Davidson had come back to life, Cass, these people don't have a chance, says the associate. I think they do, Tennell responds. No, Cass, argues the associate. You know they don't. You can't change the world with a handful of wise sayings, a seasoning of compassion, and a miracle or two. Even if one of the miracles is a dead man coming back to life, Cass asks. Not even then, says the associate. He got up and held out his hand and said, come on, Cass, it's been a long day. Time we went home. And Cass Tennell says hopelessly, but the world he promised them, the freedom. And the associate smiled a small, tired smile. It's no use, Cass. We like it in prison. We don't want to be rescued. Maybe that's true. Maybe we'd rather live in denial. We would rather believe that casual Christianity is possible, that we can be Lone Ranger Christians, that we have no responsibility for the least and the lowest in our community and in our world. Father Abraham said, sadly, to the rich man who pleads on behalf of his brothers, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. The question is, are we convinced? Are we convinced? I believe that we at Grace are convinced. That we are convinced. And it makes a difference how we live and care for the hungry of the world. So all I can say is thank you, Grace. Thanks to all of you for the way that you care for those in need. You know, this church has been known by several different names. We, of course, in our vision, it's God's heart, our hands, grace in action. The city of Des Moines refers to us as the church that never sleeps. And the entire ELCA around the country refers to us as the World Hunger Church. It's my hope and prayer that we will always be known as God's heart, our hands, grace in action, and the World Hunger Church that never sleeps.